Nobody's perfect. I'm not perfect. I'm wearing my shirt on backwards. You're not perfect. This guy isn't perfect. This guy isn't perfect. This guy isn't perfect. In fact, this guy really isn't perfect. Nobody's perfect. We all have our own ideas about how we can make life better and how we can make ourselves perfect, but perfection is impossible. We have our own ideas about how to make life better, and we always want to make our lives better by chasing perfection. But that is all we can do, chase it. We can never achieve it because we're always improving. Ultimately, we'll always be an imperfect, but at least we can live in a society where we can proudly state is somewhere close to being flawless. As if we need further proof of my imperfection, I just noticed that I have something wrong with my head here. This is a story about humanity's many attempts to correct its societies to become perfect. From the meaningless to the malicious, there have been many methods used by many multitudes of the masses, love the alliteration there, to find perfection. And today, we're going to go all the way back to the time when people thought perfection was just luck of the draw. Can you tell me anything specific about American agendas on creating utopias or perfect societies?
Well, so I don't think that utopianism was ever a particularly impactful movement in American politics directly. Certainly in the early to mid-19th century, there were several small movements that you might describe as utopian. Many of them would be religious movements. So, for instance, the Shakers or other sects deriving out of Pennsylvania religious movements, Quaker or Amish sects. I mean, you could perhaps even describe the early Mormon Church in that framework.
Religious sects have always held power in America, even during the time before it became known as the United States. When the Puritans first arrived in New England, they established a society where everyone would work for the town and would adhere to the word of God. They called this society the City Upon a Hill. Everyone in Puritan towns would know their neighbor, and those who could not fit the model of society's ideals were fined, imprisoned, even exiled. Perfect societies have been attempted for many years. These are just some of the examples.
I would say explicitly utopian, the most prominent would be Robert Owen's attempt to form a utopian socialist community in New Harmony, Indiana. That would be early 19th century, somewhere around 1815 or 1820. So Robert Owen was a Scottish textile magnate who had formed a community in Scotland called New Lanark in the early 19th century. That was based on principles of communal ownership, universal education, 8-hour workday, getting rid of child labor, things that we would now associate with socialism, or at least the labor movement in the late 19th, early 20th century. So his community in Scotland was rather successful, and he came to America around, I think, somewhere in the 18 teens, and tried to create a similar community in Indiana. It was called New Harmony, Indiana, and it only lasted a couple of years before it fell apart, largely due to the fact that they got a lot of people coming to this community who couldn't really participate in the growth of the community, who were maybe freeloading on the socialist or utopian principles.
Robert Owen can be credited as the man who first introduced socialism in the United States. Though he failed to implement a true utopia, his hopes of labor reforms would come within 50 years after he died in 1858. You see, the whole movement of utopianism became less popular, while at the same time other more progressive policies like labor unions and wage increases became more popular. The whole belief in creating a perfect society was held by elites, but the majority of Americans just wanted to be able to feed their families. Other philosophers to follow Owen would change minds, and the fact that those who had power listened to them and endorsed them helped them advance their causes. Thus, in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, we come to the beginning of a new movement. A movement by the upper class to form perfect societies. This one was called eugenics. Now, eugenics was a term created by this guy, Sir Francis Galton. He was influenced by his cousin, Charles Darwin, when he decided that he would expand upon his idea of survival of the fittest, or more specifically, who was the fittest. He believed that traits that made people the fittest were intelligence, awareness, perfect health, things that you associate with the upper class of those who didn't have to worry about labor reform because they already had quite a bit of cash to their names. And while eugenics would later take on a much different meaning, the original science behind eugenics was just the idea that some people are born better than others. I mean, that's it. Eugenics was just the science of being born into healthy, wealthy families.
Eugenics began as a way to improve societies by having there be more people of higher intellect. Galton wanted the people with the best physical and mental traits to breed more. However, as time passed, the goal shifted from having more fit people breed to having less fit people stop breeding.
Galton was the man who created the term eugenics, but the man who gave it its most commonly known meaning was this man, Harry Laughlin. Harry Laughlin was a proponent of a far more aggressive style of eugenics than Galton was. Laughlin not only thought that the fit needed to breed more, he also believed that the unfit should not be allowed to have children at all. Anyone seen as a burden on society, people with mental illnesses, people with physical handicaps, people who depended more on social welfare programs, they were targeted by Laughlin as proof that some people were just more fit than others. And not only did he successfully convince a lot of important people that he was correct about there being a problem with those seen as burdens, he also convinced them about the proper way of dealing with them, which was sterilization. Oh dear. Now, by the end of the First World War, a few states had already passed laws that allowed for states to forcibly sterilize people who were seen as unfit, primarily poor women who couldn't be trusted to take care of children. But it wasn't until Buck v. Bell that the Supreme Court, at a national level... Hold on, you don't know what Buck v. Bell is, do you? Well, for starters, Buck v. Bell was a Virginia lawsuit that made its way to the Supreme Court in 1927 that was about state laws of sterilization. Buck, or Carrie Buck, pictured here, was a woman that Virginia had deemed feeble-minded, and she had been placed in a quarantine town. She was said to be sterilized by the town. Bell, or John Bell, pictured here, was the proprietor of the quarantine town and was backed by Mr. Laughlin. He wanted to have Buck sterilized so she wouldn't be a threat to society. You see the issue here, right? So nearly all parties involved, including Buck's own attorney, were in favor of sterilizing the unfit. Buck had a daughter who was also believed to be unfit based on the vague testimony of a single Red Cross nurse, and, Buck's mother also was quarantined in the same town. I think you know where this was going. By the way, this is the third shirt I've worn since I started this, so I just want to point out that if you haven't noticed by now, maybe you're unfit, so I should declare you someone who is a burden on society.
Failure!
Sterilizations were performed in the tens of thousands in the United States. Nearly 80,000 people were forcibly sterilized in the United States in the 20th century. Sterilization, however, was not the end of eugenics. Ultimately, the Aryan ideal of a master race was born. The Nazis saw what America did to the people it considered inferior and decided to copy it, and later, take it one step further. The inferior were rounded up, quarantined, and ultimately executed en masse. Harry Laughlin inspired sterilizations in the United States. Later, he inspired the final solution in Europe.
Without ever taking so much as a look at Carrie Buck, the Supreme Court ruled that forced sterilization laws were in fact constitutional. Buck was forcibly sterilized, and many other sterilizations were performed afterward. Since the 1980s, nearly all forced sterilization laws have been wiped away from the state legislatures, and most of the victims that were sterilized since the 1980s have been in contact with the state governments that sterilized them, seeking restitution. However, the Supreme Court decision itself has never been overturned. That's important. Virginia could pass another law tomorrow that reinstates sterilization, and it would still be considered constitutional under current law. Still, that's not my favorite Virginia case brought to the U.S. Supreme Court. That would be Ruffin v. Commonwealth, and because of it, there was... Hold on. You don't know what Ruffin v. Commonwealth is, do you? Never mind that. That was just a broad description of eugenics. What other methods have been used to create utopias? Why are you asking me?
What is the answer? What is it? What is the answer?
Well, advancements in society are often associated with advancements in technology. The Industrial Revolution, for instance, expanded American society at the same time that Americans began moving west towards California. The mid-20th century also saw the South Korean people evolve into a globally competitive technological powerhouse, the one that it is today. The most prominent example, however, has to be the Soviet Union. The Soviets placed a heavy emphasis on steel and iron production when it first became a global power. Within a few years, during the Cold War, the US and USSR would participate in a space race to beat the other to the moon. Both sides, in addition to wanting to beat the other, wanted to demonstrate that their societies were in fact the best based on their technological achievements. And, you can kind of understand where they're coming from. In the end, however, neither the Soviet Union nor the United States were able to create utopian societies. The Soviet Union went bankrupt 15 years after the end of the space race, and the victory that the US achieved was more of a diplomatic and economic one than a technological one.
So we can think of, like, the Epcot Center, and, like corporations and Walt Disney and other people in the 50s and 60s putting forward a vision of a much improved future, and their assumption was that we were going to reach that future through capitalism, right? Through capitalism working well. And there's always been people, like my buddy Patrick McRae has a book called The Visioneers, which was about scientists in the 70s and 80s putting forward fantastic visions around space colonies and nanotechnology and such. So there's always been localized individuals putting forward kind of utopian visions of the future, but there's no space colonies, and for all of Elon Musk's like kind of public fantasies about doing that, we're not moving towards it very quickly. So it's not clear that technological utopianism has had that great of an impact on our society.
Technology has often been used by people in power to attempt to create perfect societies by building worlds that appear to be the most advanced on the surface. This has come in many ways.
It's true that there's been a lot of technological change over the last 150, 160 years. Now, what role did like future imaginaries of the future, of improved futures, play in that? I mean, a lot of that change has been accompanied by visions of improved futures, but it's not really clear that such fantasies have been that central to technological change. A lot of technological change involves incremental improvement in existing ways we do things, right? It's not like far futuristic, massively changed technologies. That's not really how it works.
Would it be fair to say that most technological movements that try to benefit society often do that, but not for the explicit performance of creating a perfect society?
Yeah, it's just about profit and efficiency. That's how most change comes about.
Utopianism has also been adapted in fiction as well, with imagined societies being perfected by those with agendas. Social reformer Charlotte Perkins Gilman, for instance, imagined a society that only consists of women as a utopia. Utopian fiction is the author's way of expressing what a perfect society would look like in the author's mind. It often comes with a philosophy to express them. Utopian societies have never truly been realized, and the attempts to create them have always ended in failure. We set our goals on the models of utopias, and we never get to achieve our goals. But that's the point. We can never make utopias real. We can only get close to them. Life is about getting better, not already being the best. Utopias may never be real, but that doesn't mean we can't all make the world a better place.